Story 1. The bus stop that shouldn't exist. It was a rainy night, and the streets shimmered under the dim glow of streetlights. The city seemed quieter than usual, cloaked in a strange stillness. Mia pulled her jacket tighter around herself as she approached the bus stop. Her shoes splashed through shallow puddles as the distant rumble of thunder echoed above. The bus stop wasn't like others she'd seen. It stood alone at the edge of an abandoned park that was long overgrown. The bench was old, the paint peeling, and the glass walls had strange, foggy markings. Yet this was the quickest way home. She told herself that it didn't matter how eerie it looked. She was just tired and imagining things. The schedule on the glass showed that bus 306 would arrive at 12:13 a.m. Oddly specific for a route she didn't remember seeing before. She glanced at her phone. 12:05 a.m. A few minutes wouldn't hurt. The rain intensified, drumming on the shelter's roof. Mia wiped away some of the foggy streaks on the glass wall to look outside. She froze. Written faintly on the inside of the glass in shaky handwriting were the words, "Don't get on the bus." Her heart thumped painfully in her chest. She took a step back, staring at the message as though it might change. But it didn't. The rain blurred the letters slightly, but they remained, etched like a warning. Mia laughed nervously. Someone's idea of a prank, she thought. Maybe a bored teenager scribbled it as a joke. She sat down and tried to distract herself by scrolling through her phone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then she heard it, the low, steady hum of an engine. Headlights pierced through the sheets of rain as the bus came into view, its hulking frame slowing as it approached the stop. The number on the front read 306, just as the sign said. The bus was old, its paint chipped, and the windows fogged up so much that she couldn't see the driver. But it stopped perfectly in front of her. The doors hissed open, releasing a puff of cold air. Mia hesitated. Inside, the dim lights flickered slightly. She could faintly make out the silhouettes of other passengers seated inside, all unnervingly still. No one turned to look at her. The rain poured harder. Mia bit her lip. She was soaked, freezing, and tired. Whatever that creepy note was, it couldn't possibly mean anything. She stepped inside. As soon as she crossed the threshold, a strange sensation washed over her. A weight pressed down on her chest. The air felt heavier, colder, almost suffocating. She dropped into the nearest seat, clutching her bag tightly. The doors closed with a soft thunk, and the bus rolled forward into the rain. She looked around at the passengers. Their heads were bowed, faces shadowed by the dim, flickering lights. She couldn't see their features clearly, but something about their stillness made her stomach churn. No one was using their phone. No one moved at all. The bus rattled quietly along the empty road. Mia tried to calm herself by staring out the window, but the landscape outside didn't look familiar. The streets were dark, with no signs, no buildings. Just endless, twisting roads surrounded by thick trees that seemed to loom closer with each passing second. Her unease deepened when she noticed something odd. There were no stops. The bus wasn't slowing down for anything. She checked her phone. No signal. The battery was at 70%, but it was useless without a connection. After what felt like an eternity, she decided to ask the driver where the next stop was. She stood and walked cautiously toward the front of the bus. As she got closer, the driver's figure remained eerily still. His uniform was faded, and his cap cast a deep shadow over his face. Mia cleared her throat. "Excuse me, where's this bus going?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The driver didn't respond. He didn't move at all. She reached out a hand to tap his shoulder and froze. His skin was ice cold to the touch, and when she looked closer, she saw why. His face wasn't human. It was made of something like wax, with cracks running down his cheeks. His eyes were hollow, dark voids. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the bus as something behind her fell to the floor. She turned and gasped. The passengers were no longer seated. They were standing in the aisle, facing her. Their faces were pale, lifeless. Their mouths were slightly open, but no sound came out. Their eyes? They had no eyes. Mia stumbled back, her heart racing. She turned and slammed her fists against the doors, screaming, "Let me out!" The bus didn't slow. The driver's lifeless body remained at the wheel, and the eyeless figures stepped closer, their feet dragging against the floor. Then she saw it. A stop ahead in the middle of nowhere, a lone signpost barely illuminated by the bus's headlights. She grabbed the emergency lever and yanked it with all her strength. The doors burst open with a violent hiss. Without thinking, Mia leaped off the moving bus, tumbling onto the wet road. She scrambled to her feet, bruised and shaking. The bus roared away, its taillights fading into the distance. She could still hear the faint, haunting hum of its engine as it disappeared into the dark. Breathing heavily, she looked up. The stop she had jumped onto was the exact same bus stop where she had gotten on. Her head spun in disbelief. The message was still there, faint but visible. "Don't get on the bus." Mia took a step back, then another until she was running, sprinting away from that cursed bus stop with everything she had. She didn't stop until she saw the familiar glow of a convenience store at the end of the street. She never took the 306 route again. Months later, she read an old article about an abandoned bus route that had been shut down years ago after a deadly crash. The article mentioned the number, Bus 306, and that it was said to still haunt the night for lost travelers. To this day, Mia avoids bus stations late at night, and when she tells her story, she always ends it with the same warning. If you see Bus 306, don't get on. No matter how cold or tired you are, don't. Story 2. The final bus stop. The city was draped in a blanket of fog, the kind that muffled every sound and made even familiar places feel alien. Jenna shivered as she walked down the deserted street, clutching her coat tightly. She had missed the last train home, and now her only option was to take the night bus, a route she rarely used and knew little about. The bus stop was at the very edge of the city, where buildings thinned and the darkness of the countryside began. Its lone streetlight flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows. The air felt colder here, heavier somehow. As Jenna approached, she noticed something odd. The stop sign didn't have a number. It simply read, "Final Stop," in faded, peeling letters. She checked her phone. The screen showed 11:45 p.m. The night bus was supposed to arrive at 11:50 p.m. She sighed and leaned against the glass shelter, trying to ignore the gnawing unease creeping up her spine. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. The street was unnervingly quiet. No cars, no footsteps, not even the sound of wind. Jenna glanced around, her eyes catching faint graffiti scrawled on the glass behind her. It read, "Get off before the final stop." Her heart skipped a beat. She turned to look more closely, but the letters seemed to blur and fade as she stared. She shook her head, blaming her tired mind for playing tricks on her. At exactly 11:50 p.m., headlights pierced through the fog. The bus approached, its massive frame creaking to a halt in front of her. The doors hissed open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Jenna hesitated. The driver didn't acknowledge her. He sat stiffly, his face obscured by shadows. "Home's not far," she muttered to herself, stepping onto the bus. The interior smelled faintly of damp metal and something she couldn't quite place. She glanced around. There were a few passengers scattered throughout the seats, but their faces were oddly turned away from her, as if deliberately avoiding her gaze. The lights above flickered sporadically, casting unsettling patterns on the floor. Jenna chose a seat near the middle, keeping her bag close. The bus jolted forward with a low groan, the fog outside swallowing everything in its path. At first, the ride was uneventful, though unnervingly quiet. No one spoke, no one moved. She noticed that the windows seemed oddly tinted, making it impossible to see where they were going. Jenna tried to focus on her phone, but the screen displayed no signal, no matter how many times she refreshed. Then the bus stopped. The doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and a man stepped on. He was tall, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. His clothes looked old, like something from decades ago, and his footsteps echoed unnaturally as he walked down the aisle. He passed Jenna without a glance and sat near the back. The bus moved again. Jenna felt her skin prickle. The new passenger sat motionless, staring straight ahead, just like the others. As the journey continued, more passengers got on at each stop. Each of them shared the same strange characteristics: pale skin, outdated clothing, and an eerie stillness. By now, the bus was nearly full, but Jenna noticed something horrifying. None of the passengers blinked. Not once. The bus lurched to a stop again, and this time no one got on. Instead, the driver turned slightly toward her. His face was barely visible in the dim light, but Jenna could see enough to make her blood run cold. His eyes were pitch black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the weak light around him. "Next stop. Final stop," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally through the bus. Jenna's chest tightened. She fumbled for the stop button, but it didn't work. She pressed it again and again, her panic rising. "I want to get off," she shouted, but the driver ignored her. The passengers began to stir. Slowly, unnaturally, they turned their heads toward her in unison. Their eyes were the same as the driver's, black, empty voids. A low, guttural sound began to fill the bus, a mix of whispers and growls that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jenna bolted from her seat, rushing toward the front of the bus. She pounded on the doors. "Let me out!" she screamed. The driver didn't respond. The bus kept moving, faster now, the scenery outside blurring into a smudge of gray and black. The whispers grew louder. She turned and saw the passengers rising from their seats, their movements jerky and unnatural, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions, mouths opening far too wide, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. Jenna's hands found the emergency lever near the door. She yanked it with all her strength. The doors burst open, and she jumped, tumbling onto the wet pavement. Pain shot through her leg as she hit the ground, but she didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was. There were no streetlights, no signs, just an endless, foggy road. Behind her, the bus screeched to a halt. She turned briefly and saw the passengers spilling out, their forms twisting and writhing as they crawled toward her with impossible speed. Jenna ran until her legs gave out. She collapsed by the side of the road, her lungs burning. When she looked up, the bus was gone, and so were the figures. The fog began to lift, revealing a familiar street. She staggered toward the faint glow of a convenience store in the distance. Inside, the cashier gave her a strange look. "You okay, miss?" he asked. I was on the bus," she stammered. "The night bus. The one to the final stop." The man's face paled. "That route was shut down years ago," he said. "There was an accident. No one survived." Jenna's blood ran cold. She looked out the window, half expecting to see the bus waiting outside. But there was nothing, just the quiet street and the faint hum of the city. She never took another night bus again. But sometimes, late at night, she swears she can hear it. A low, mechanical rumble, followed by the faint hiss of doors opening. If you ever find yourself at a bus stop with no number, and the sign says, "Final stop," don't get on. No matter how desperate you are, don't. Story 3. The bus stop by the cemetery. The air was cold and damp as Mia walked through the quiet streets on her way home. Her part-time shift had ended later than usual, and now she was stuck taking the late bus. The city bus routes changed at night, and the only stop nearby was the one by Blackwood Cemetery, a place locals rarely mentioned without a nervous glance. The cemetery was infamous. Stories of strange sightings, disappearing shadows, and ghostly whispers had surrounded it for decades. But Mia didn't believe in ghosts. She told herself those were just stories made to scare kids. Besides, she was too tired to care. All she wanted was to get home. When she arrived at the bus stop, a wave of unease settled over her. The stop was dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp. The cemetery loomed nearby, its wrought iron gates wide open as if inviting someone or something in. The gravestones stretched endlessly into the darkness, barely visible through the mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. Mia shook off her nerves and sat down on the cold metal bench, glancing at the old, rusted sign. The next bus would arrive at 11:45 p.m. She checked her phone. 11:30 p.m. 15 minutes of waiting didn't seem so bad, but as the minutes dragged on, the night seemed to stretch unnaturally. As the clock ticked to 11:40 p.m., Mia noticed something strange. The mist from the cemetery seemed to be creeping closer, spilling onto the street. It moved unnaturally, swirling like it was alive. The hair on her arms stood up as she watched it inch closer to the bus stop. She turned her head and saw someone approaching from down the road. A man in a long coat, his head bowed low. She felt a strange sense of relief. At least I'm not alone, she thought. But as the figure drew closer, her relief quickly turned into unease. The man's face was pale, unnaturally so, like it had been drained of blood. His eyes were hollow, sunken pits. When he reached the stop, he didn't sit down or acknowledge her. Instead, he stood perfectly still, facing the cemetery gates. Mia tried to avoid staring, but the air around her felt colder now, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. She couldn't help but glance at the man again, and her heart almost stopped. His feet weren't touching the ground. She blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, he was hovering just inches above the pavement. Before she could even process what she was seeing, the bus's headlights appeared in the distance. The low rumble of the engine echoed through the street as it slowed to a stop in front of her. The doors opened with a hiss. The driver, a gaunt, older man with weary eyes, looked at Mia but didn't say a word. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But the thought of waiting alone with the strange figure at the stop felt even worse. Mia quickly stepped onto the bus and took a seat near the middle. The man in the coat followed her silently, sitting across from her. The bus doors shut, and the vehicle lurched forward. The ride was unnervingly quiet. There were only a few other passengers, all seated near the back. None of them spoke or even moved. Mia tried to focus on her phone, but there was no signal. She stole a glance at the man across from her. He was staring out the window, but his reflection didn't match his posture. It was staring straight at her. Her blood turned cold. She looked away, her breath shallow. Just get through this ride, she thought. The bus passed through winding streets she didn't recognize. She frowned. This wasn't the usual route home. She stood and made her way to the driver. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Isn't this the route to East Main Street?" The driver didn't answer. "Sir?" she asked again, stepping closer. When he finally turned, Mia's stomach twisted in horror. His eyes were clouded over, his pupils milky white. He wasn't breathing, his chest didn't rise or fall. "The final stop," he whispered in a voice that didn't belong to him. It was layered, deep, and echoed like multiple voices speaking at once. "You should never have boarded." Mia stumbled back, nearly falling. The passengers at the back of the bus began to stir. Slowly, they turned their heads toward her, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Their faces were gaunt and sunken, as though they had been buried for years. The man in the coat rose from his seat. His coat fell open, revealing a rotting, skeletal torso beneath. He took a slow step toward her, and with each step, the bus grew colder. Mia's instincts kicked in. She ran to the back door and yanked the emergency exit handle. Nothing happened. She screamed and pounded on the glass, her breath fogging up the window. The man reached out a skeletal hand, his fingers brushing her shoulder. Pain shot through her entire body, a cold, searing pain that made her vision blur. She turned and saw the cemetery coming into view through the windows. The bus was heading straight toward its gates. "No!" Mia screamed, yanking the handle again. This time, the door burst open, and cold night air rushed in. Without thinking, she jumped. She hit the ground hard, rolling onto the wet pavement. Pain shot through her arms and legs, but she forced herself to her feet. The bus continued forward, passing through the iron gates of the cemetery without slowing down. Its headlights faded into the fog, swallowed whole by the darkness. Mia stood there, shaking, trying to catch her breath. The street was empty now. The bus stop was gone. In its place was a single gravestone, cracked and covered in ivy. She stumbled toward it, her eyes widening as she read the inscription. "For those who board the bus of the dead, there is no return." Mia never took the late-night bus again. Weeks later, she heard about a local legend, a bus that picked up souls near Blackwood Cemetery, taking them to the afterlife. No one who stayed on past the cemetery gates was ever seen again. To this day, Mia swears she can still hear the bus sometimes. A low rumble in the distance, the faint hiss of its doors opening. She warns anyone who will listen, never take the last bus near a cemetery, because once you step on, you might never step off. Story 4. The Abandoned Bus Stop. The old bus stop at the edge of town had stood abandoned for years, left to decay after the city rerouted its transit lines. No one knew why the stop was left to rot. It was rumored that something happened there one night, though the details were always vague. Most of the locals avoided it entirely. They whispered about strange figures and unsettling noises late at night. But to Ellie, those stories were just urban legends. She was a journalist, always chasing real stories, not ghost tales. And tonight, she was determined to see for herself what was so terrifying about that forgotten place. The sky was a dull shade of gray as she drove her car to the outskirts of town, the last traces of daylight fading behind her. The abandoned bus stop sat at the end of an overgrown road, surrounded by dead trees. The wind howled softly, stirring the brittle branches. Ellie parked a short distance away, grabbed her flashlight, and walked toward the stop. The structure was barely standing, its glass walls cracked and covered in grime, and the wooden bench inside was rotting, sagging under the weight of time. Above the stop, the old route sign still hung crookedly. The words Route 84 were faded but legible. Ellie shined her flashlight over the bus schedule, now yellowed and torn. The last bus listed was at 11:30 p.m., dated years ago, but below it, someone had scrawled a warning in red, jagged letters. "Do not wait here." Ellie's stomach twisted, but she pushed the unease aside. She pulled out her phone to take a few pictures, but the screen was flickering, the signal completely gone. She muttered a curse and pocketed it. As she stood there, the wind seemed to die down. The silence was almost deafening. And then, faintly, impossibly, she heard it. The low hum of an engine. She froze, her pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, and two faint beams of light pierced through the darkness, heading straight toward the stop. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. A bus? Out here? The vehicle slowed and came to a halt with an eerie precision. The doors hissed open, and Ellie took a cautious step forward. The bus was old, far older than any she'd seen in use. Its paint was chipped and rusted, the windows clouded with grime. The route sign above the windshield read, 84, last ride. Ellie peered inside. The dim, flickering lights revealed empty seats and an eerie stillness. The driver sat slumped at the wheel, motionless, wearing a uniform that looked decades old. His head was bowed, his face hidden beneath the brim of his cap. Ellie's instincts screamed at her to leave, but curiosity tugged at her just as hard. This was exactly the kind of story that could make her career. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the bus. The doors shut behind her with a soft thud. She jumped slightly at the sound but steadied herself. She scanned the empty seats and noticed something strange. Each seat had an item left behind. A single shoe, an old book, a child's doll with one eye missing. The eerie assortment sent a chill down her spine. Ellie moved toward the front of the bus. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the quiet space. The driver didn't move. She reached out and gently touched his shoulder and gasped. His skin was cold and hard, like stone. Slowly, his head tilted upward, and she saw his face, or rather, what was left of it. His eyes were hollow sockets, and his face was cracked like porcelain, with jagged fissures running down his cheeks. His mouth opened slightly, and a whisper escaped. "You shouldn't be here." Ellie stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The bus lurched forward without warning, sending her tumbling into a seat. She scrambled to her feet and banged on the doors. "Stop! Let me out!" she shouted, but the bus kept moving. The landscape outside was no longer familiar. It wasn't even real. The road twisted through an endless expanse of shadows, with skeletal trees lining the way. There were no signs, no lights, only an oppressive darkness that seemed to close in with every second. The driver spoke again, his voice fractured and echoing. "Once you board, there's no turning back." Ellie turned and saw something that made her blood run cold. The seats behind her were no longer empty. Shadowy figures had appeared, vague, human-like shapes with glowing white eyes. They sat silently, their heads turning toward her in unison. One of the figures rose from its seat and began walking toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face was featureless, but Ellie could feel its stare burning into her. She backed away, her mind screaming for an escape. The bus slowed as it neared a single stop, a decrepit platform surrounded by nothing but void. A sign hung loosely, swinging in the wind. It read, "The end of the line." The doors opened with a hiss. Ellie's instincts kicked in. She bolted toward the exit and leapt off the bus, hitting the ground hard. She rolled onto the cracked pavement, her head spinning. The bus remained still for a moment, its headlights glowing like malevolent eyes. Then, without warning, it vanished, fading into the darkness as if it had never been there. Ellie lay on the ground, gasping for breath. When she looked around, she realized she was back at the abandoned bus stop. The night was quiet again, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. She staggered to her feet, brushing the dirt off her clothes. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, signal restored. She glanced at the time, 11:31 p.m. A chill ran down her spine. Only a minute had passed. Ellie didn't wait to understand. She sprinted back to her car, her heart hammering in her chest. When she reached it, she locked the doors and drove away as fast as she could. The bus stopped disappearing in her rearview mirror. The next morning, Ellie tried to research Route 84, but every source she checked told the same story. The route had been shut down 30 years ago after a tragic accident. A bus had gone off the road and into a ravine during a storm. Everyone on board had died. Ellie never went near the abandoned bus stop again. But every time she drove past that part of town, she could feel it watching her. The place that waited for another soul to board. And sometimes, when the night was quiet enough, she could still hear it. The low hum of an engine, the soft hiss of doors opening, and a voice whispering, "The last ride is never over." Story 5: The Man at the Bus Stop. It was a bitterly cold evening, and the streets were eerily quiet as Emily walked toward the bus stop. She pulled her scarf tighter, her breath forming faint clouds in the freezing air. It was late, much later than she usually stayed out, and the city felt strange under the cover of darkness. The bus stop was dimly lit by a flickering street lamp, the glow casting long, shifting shadows. As she approached, she saw someone standing there. A man. He was tall, wearing an old, tattered coat that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. His head was bowed, and his face was obscured by the brim of a hat. Something about him made Emily's stomach tighten. She hesitated, her footsteps slowing. Just a fellow passenger, she told herself. She couldn't let her imagination run wild. After all, it was just a bus stop. Emily stepped under the shelter, keeping a few feet between herself and the man. She glanced at the schedule posted on the glass. The last bus was due in 5 minutes. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, trying to keep warm, but the man's presence was unsettling. He hadn't moved since she arrived. Not a twitch, not even the subtle rise and fall of breathing. He was perfectly still, like a statue. Emily glanced at him again, trying to be discreet. His coat was frayed, and his hands hung limply at his sides, pale and almost skeletal. She looked away quickly when she realized his head was now slightly tilted in her direction. Her pulse quickened. It's nothing, she thought. Maybe he's just cold. Minutes crawled by, feeling like hours. The street was utterly silent except for the faint hum of the street lamp above. Emily checked her phone. No signal. She sighed and shoved it back into her pocket. When she looked up, her heart nearly stopped. The man had moved. He was no longer standing under the light but had taken a step back, retreating into the shadows. His head was still tilted toward her, but his face was just out of view. Emily felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Waiting for the bus too?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, trying to break the tension. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. The distant hum of an engine broke the silence. Emily turned her head to see the bus approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over her. She stepped closer to the curb, eager to put distance between herself and the unsettling figure. The bus came to a stop with a soft hiss. The doors opened, and Emily quickly climbed aboard. She chose a seat near the middle, close to the door, and glanced back toward the stop. The man was still standing there, motionless. But as the bus began to pull away, he moved. He stepped into the light, revealing his face for the first time. Emily's breath caught in her throat. His skin was gray and sunken, his eyes dark and hollow. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, showing teeth that were far too sharp. She turned away, her heart pounding. "It's just my imagination," she thought, squeezing her eyes shut. "I'm tired and cold, and I'm letting myself get freaked out." But when she opened her eyes, her blood ran cold. He was on the bus. The man was seated at the back, his head turned directly toward her. The bus hadn't stopped to let him on. She was sure of it. He hadn't been there a moment ago. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her bag. The other passengers seemed oblivious, their heads down, focused on their phones or staring blankly out the windows. She turned toward the driver. "Excuse me," she called, her voice shaky. "Can you stop the bus? I think I need to get off." The driver didn't respond. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his face unreadable in the dim light. Emily stood and started toward the front of the bus, but as she passed the rows of seats, she realized something was terribly wrong. The passengers weren't moving. They weren't even breathing. Their skin was pale, their eyes vacant, and their bodies unnaturally stiff, as if they were mannequins. Her stomach churned. She turned back toward her seat and froze. The man was gone. Panic surged through her. She spun around, her eyes darting across the bus. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, closing in on her. She could hear something now, a faint, guttural breathing, coming from everywhere and nowhere. She backed toward the doors, her fingers fumbling for the emergency release lever. The breathing grew louder, closer. She yanked the lever, and the doors burst open with a hiss. Without thinking, she leapt out, tumbling onto the cold pavement. She scrambled to her feet and looked around. The bus was gone. The street was silent, the air heavy. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. And then she saw him. The man was standing under a streetlight a few feet away, his grin wider than before, his hollow eyes locked onto hers. Slowly, he raised one skeletal hand and pointed at her. "Your stop is next," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that sent chills through her entire body. Emily didn't wait to hear more. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty streets. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her and locking every bolt. That night, Emily didn't sleep. She sat by the window, clutching a kitchen knife, her eyes darting to every shadow. But the man didn't appear. In the days that followed, she tried to forget what had happened, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But every time she passed a bus stop, she felt his presence, like he was watching, waiting. And late at night, when the streets were quiet and the wind whispered through the city, she could still hear his voice. "Your stop is next."